Have you ever woken up in the dead of night, heart pounding, drenched in sweat because of a nightmare so vivid that you couldn't shake the feeling it left behind? Now imagine that dream wasn't just a product of your mind, but a dark doorway into something far more sinister. Tonight, I'm taking you on a journey into a story that blurs the line between dream and reality. A tale that begins in the silence of sleep, but ends in a place where the echoes of terror and mystery refuse to fade. But before we step into this shadowy world, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button, because what I'm about to share is not for the faint of heart. These stories are for those who dare to explore the dark corners where nightmares are born. As the story unfolds, you'll feel the creeping dread that comes with the realization that not all dreams are meant to be forgotten. Some linger, haunting your waking hours, making you question what is real and what is a figment of a mind teetering on the edge of sanity. This story is one such tale, a tale that begins innocently enough but soon spirals into a labyrinth of fear where each turn plunges you deeper into the unknown. Imagine lying in bed, the world around you quiet and still, but your mind refuses to rest. You drift into sleep, only to find yourself in a place that is both unfamiliar and unnervingly real. The air is thick with an unnatural chill and the darkness seems to breathe, watching your every move. As you walk through this eerie landscape, something begins to stir in the pit of your stomach, a feeling that you are not alone, that something is lurking, just out of sight, waiting. But this isn't just a dream. It's a warning, a prelude to a terror that you can't escape by simply waking up. Because when you open your eyes, the real nightmare begins. The shadows from your dream cling to the corners of your room, and you start to wonder, did you really leave that world behind, or did something follow you back? This is your last chance to turn back, to leave this story behind. But if you choose to stay, know that once you cross this threshold, there is no going back. Subscribe, like, and prepare yourself for a story that will keep you up at night, long after the lights go out. Welcome to the nightmare. Let's begin. It started like any other night. Nothing out of the ordinary, no warning signs of the horror that was about to unfold. I fell asleep, slipping into a dream as usual, but this time, something felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a thick, suffocating presence that seemed to wrap around me as I drifted deeper into unconsciousness. Suddenly, I found myself standing before an ancient, decaying mansion, its towering silhouette looming against a moonless sky. The mansion was nestled deep within a dense, twisted forest, its gnarled branches clawing at the darkened windows like skeletal fingers reaching out from the grave. The mansion itself was a grotesque sight. Its walls, once grand, were now cracked and crumbling, overrun with a creeping, blackened ivy that seemed to pulsate with a life of its own. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and every breath felt like inhaling a fog of dread. As I stepped closer, the massive wooden door creaked open on its own, revealing a dark, yawning void inside. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but something, an invisible force perhaps, pulled me forward, compelling me to cross the threshold. Inside, the silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of something dripping, slow, rhythmic, like the beating of a monstrous heart. The floorboards groaned under my weight, each step echoing through the vast, empty halls. The walls were lined with portraits, their faces hidden by layers of dust and cobwebs, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. The deeper I ventured, the stronger the sense of familiarity grew, as if I had been here before, in another life, another time. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that the mansion wasn't just a place. It was a memory, one I had no recollection of, but that was somehow etched into my very soul. As I explored the winding corridors, a faint light flickered at the end of a long, narrow hallway. It was a sickly, pale light, barely illuminating the darkness, but it was enough to guide my way. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, each step taking me further from reality and deeper into the unknown. The air grew colder, and I could feel the walls closing in around me, as if the mansion itself was alive, a malevolent entity determined to trap me within its decaying embrace. Finally, I reached the source of the light, a single, half-melted candle sitting atop a small wooden table in the center of an otherwise empty room. The flame flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the walls like the twisted figures of a macabre ballet. On the table lay an old leather-bound book, its cover worn and cracked with age. I felt an overwhelming urge to open it, to uncover the secrets hidden within its pages. But as I reached out to touch it, a low, guttural whisper echoed through the room, freezing me in place. The whisper was not in any language I could understand, but its meaning was clear. Turn back now, before it's too late. My heart raced as I glanced around the room, searching for the source of the voice, but there was no one there, only the shadows, shifting and writhing as if alive. I wanted to flee, to escape this nightmare, but my feet were rooted to the floor, my hand hovering over the book as if drawn by an invisible thread. Against my better judgment, I opened the book. The pages were blank at first, but as I stared at them, words began to appear. Dark, cryptic symbols that seemed to pulse with a sinister energy. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, filling my mind with a cacophony of voices, all warning me to leave. But it was too late. The moment I had opened the book, I had sealed my fate. The room began to spin, the shadows closing in on me as the light from the candle sputtered and died, plunging me into total darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the dream ended. I awoke in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. But the terror didn't end there, because when I looked around my room, I realized with horror that the book from the dream was sitting on my nightstand, its cover still warm to the touch. After the terror of the dream, waking up should have been a relief, a return to the safety and familiarity of the real world. But that sense of relief never came. From the moment my eyes opened, a deep unease settled over me, like a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. The room felt off, the air thicker and the shadows darker than usual. Every noise, every creak of the house seemed magnified, as if the walls themselves were whispering secrets I wasn't meant to hear. The book, that book, sat ominously on my nightstand, just as it had appeared in the dream. Its presence was a stark reminder that whatever had happened during the night had followed me into the waking world. The leather cover was worn and cracked, the dark symbols on its pages still fresh in my mind. My instincts screamed at me to get rid of it, to throw it away, burn it, anything to rid myself of the creeping dread it brought with it. But something held me back. A morbid curiosity, perhaps, or a fear that destroying it would somehow unleash something even worse. Days passed, but the fear didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger, more suffocating. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt like a trap. A labyrinth of shadows that twisted and writhed at the edges of my vision. I began to hear things, soft whispers, almost too quiet to catch, but unmistakable. They would start in the dead of night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, pulling me back to the edge of consciousness with their insistent murmuring. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe just the remnants of a nightmare. But as the nights wore on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were coming from the book. Every time I dared to open it, the symbols seemed to shift on the page, rearranging themselves into patterns that made no sense but filled me with an inexplicable dread. The whispers would start as soon as my fingers brushed the cover, growing into a chorus of voices that echoed in my mind, each one more desperate than the last. They spoke of things I couldn't comprehend, of ancient rituals, of dark forces bound by blood and sacrifice, of a fate that was now inescapably linked to mine. I tried to resist, to ignore the pull of the book, but it was like a drug. Each time I closed it, I found myself drawn back, compelled to decipher the symbols, to uncover whatever dark secret it held. The world outside the book became a blur, my days blending into nights, the whispers following me wherever I went. It wasn't long before I started to see things, shadows that moved on their own, shapes flickering at the corners of my vision, always gone by the time I turned to look. But the worst were the eyes, cold, hollow eyes that watched me from the darkness, never blinking, never looking away. Sleep became a distant memory. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that mansion, wandering the endless corridors, the air thick with the smell of decay. The book was always with me, its pages now filled with vivid, horrific images, visions of rituals and sacrifices, of figures cloaked in shadow, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods. The dreams were no longer just dreams. They were memories, fragments of a life that wasn't mine, but that I was somehow living through, night after night. The tension built like a storm, the pressure mounting until it felt like I would break. I was no longer sure where the dream ended and reality began. the line between the two blurred, the darkness from the dream seeping into my waking hours, tainting everything with its oppressive presence. I could feel the mansion's influence creeping into my mind, twisting my thoughts, filling me with a dread that I couldn't shake. And always, the book was there, waiting, its pages whispering promises of answers, of an end to the terror. But with every turn of the page, the whispers grew darker, more insistent, until they became a deafening roar that drowned out all reason. I knew I was spiraling into madness, but I couldn't stop. The fear had taken root deep inside me, spreading like a poison, and the only way to rid myself of it was to find out what the book wanted, what it wanted. The final straw came on a night that felt colder, darker than any before. The whispers were louder than ever, a cacophony of voices that echoed through the house, filling every corner with their dark, desperate plea. I could feel the mansion closing in around me, its walls pressing in, the shadows creeping closer, their cold fingers brushing against my skin. The eyes were there too, watching, waiting, as if daring me to take that final step, to uncover the truth hidden within the pages. I knew there was no turning back. Whatever lay at the end of this journey, I had to see it through. With trembling hands, I picked up the book, the voices reaching a fever pitch as I opened it one last time. The symbols on the page writhed like living things, their meaning just out of reach, taunting me. And then suddenly, everything went silent. The shadows stopped moving, the eyes disappeared, the whispers ceased. And in that moment of perfect, terrifying stillness, I realized the truth. The book wasn't just a gateway to another world. It was the other world. A prison for something ancient and malevolent, something that had been waiting for someone, me, to set it free. But by then, it was too late to stop. The door had been opened, and whatever was on the other side was coming through. The last thing I heard before the darkness swallowed me was the sound of the book closing itself, the final page turning as the thing that had been trapped inside for so long stepped into the world. The night when everything unraveled began like any other. I had grown accustomed to the creeping dread that lingered in my home, to the whispers that followed me everywhere, and to the book that seemed to hold the key to some unspeakable horror. But nothing could have prepared me for what was about to happen. I had barely drifted off to sleep when I found myself back in the mansion, the nightmare pulling me into its twisted reality once more. This time, the mansion was even more decayed. The walls crumbling, the air thick with the stench of rot and death. The corridors were darker, the shadows deeper, as if the very fabric of the place was unraveling, collapsing in on itself. But what struck me most was the silence. A profound, suffocating silence that pressed down on me like a weight, amplifying every creak of the floorboards, every breath I took. I knew I wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, an oppressive presence that seemed to cling to my skin, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I could feel it, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. My heart pounded in my chest as I moved through the halls, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to run, but I couldn't. Something was pulling me deeper into the mansion, guiding my steps like a puppet on strings. I turned a corner, and there it was, the room from my previous dream, the one with the sickly candlelight and the old, leather-bound book. But this time, the door was wide open, and the light inside flickered wildly, casting grotesque, distorted shadows on the walls. My feet carried me forward, even as my mind begged me to stop, to turn around and never look back. But I had to know. I had to see what lay beyond that door. As I stepped into the room, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash, trapping me inside. The candle on the table sputtered and died, plunging the room into pitch blackness. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to see, to hear anything in the suffocating silence. And then, I felt it. A cold, unnatural breeze that swept through the room, carrying with it the scent of decay and something far worse, something ancient and malevolent. In the darkness, I heard it. A slow, deliberate movement, like the sound of heavy footsteps dragging across the floor. My heart raced as I realized it was coming closer, closing the distance between us with every agonizing second. I tried to move, to run, but my body refused to obey, paralyzed by a fear so intense it felt like ice in my veins. And then, out of the darkness, it emerged. A figure, more shadow than substance, its form shifting and undulating like smoke. It stood at the far end of the room, facing me, but where its face should have been, there was only darkness, an abyss that seemed to swallow all light. It was the same figure from my previous dream, but now it was here, in the flesh, or whatever it was made of, standing mere feet away from me. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The air between us was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. And then, slowly, it began to advance. Each step it took was deliberate, almost predatory, as if it was savoring the terror that radiated off me in waves. My heart pounded in my ears as I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. No escape from the nightmare that had become my reality. As it drew closer, I could see more clearly. Its form was indistinct, like a shadow made solid, but its presence was overwhelming, a black hole of malice and dread. The whispers I had heard in the book now echoed in my mind, a chorus of voices pleading, warning. But it was too late. The thing was almost upon me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. In a last, desperate attempt to escape, I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping against hope that I would wake up, that this would all be over. But when I opened them again, I was still there, and so was it. Now standing directly in front of me, its faceless head tilted as if studying me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out, my throat constricted by an invisible force. Suddenly, it reached out, its shadowy hand stretching toward me. As it touched my skin, a wave of cold so intense it felt like burning washed over me, and my vision blurred, the room spinning as my mind teetered on the edge of oblivion. I could feel it, pulling at something deep inside me, something primal and ancient, something that had been buried for centuries. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The figure withdrew its hand, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, my body shaking uncontrollably. But the nightmare was far from over. As I lay there, trembling, the figure began to speak, not in words, but in thoughts, a voice that echoed in the deepest recesses of my mind. It spoke of things I couldn't comprehend, of an ancient curse, a binding ritual, and a fate that was now inescapably linked to mine. The darkness around me pulsed with its words, the walls seeming to close in as it revealed the truth. I was not the first to dream of this place, and I would not be the last. The book was a gateway, a conduit for something far older and more malevolent than I could ever imagine. And by opening it, I had set that something free. The figure began to fade, its form dissolving into the shadows, but before it disappeared completely, it spoke one final, chilling thought. You are mine now. And then, everything went black. When I awoke, I was back in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding as if I had just run a marathon. The room was dark, the air heavy with the lingering scent of decay. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, just another nightmare. But when I looked at my nightstand, the book was gone. And in its place was something far worse. A small, blackened mark on the wood, shaped like a handprint, still smoking as if freshly burned into the surface. I knew then that the nightmare was far from over. The figure was real, and it was still out there, waiting, watching. And no matter how hard I tried to forget, to move on, it would always be there, lurking in the shadows, ready to claim what was now rightfully its own. Because once the darkness has touched you, it never lets go. In the days that followed, the line between dream and reality blurred beyond recognition. The mark on my nightstand was a constant reminder of the horror that had unfolded, a scar left by something that should not exist. I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. The nightmare had crossed into the real world, and there was no escaping it. I became obsessed with the events of that night, consumed by the need to understand what had happened, to find some rational explanation for the terror that had invaded my life. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, followed, even in the brightest daylight. Every shadow seemed to harbor a presence. Every creak of the floorboards echoed with unseen footsteps. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I feared I would wake up in that decaying mansion again, face to face with the faceless figure. It wasn't long before I began to dig deeper, desperate for answers. I scoured the internet, poring over forums and obscure websites dedicated to the paranormal, looking for anything that might explain what was happening to me. But the more I searched, the more the dread grew. The stories I found were eerily similar to my own. Accounts of people who had experienced vivid, terrifying dreams that bled into their waking lives, leaving behind marks, shadows, and an overwhelming sense of being hunted. But what struck me most was that all of these stories shared one common element: the mansion. It was a place shrouded in mystery, mentioned only in hushed whispers on forums and in the darkest corners of the web. No one knew where it was located or even if it existed in the physical world. Some claimed it was a portal, a gateway to another dimension, a place where nightmares took on a life of their own. Others believed it was cursed, a manifestation of pure evil that trapped souls within its walls, feeding on their fear. But there was one detail that sent chills down my spine. Those who entered the mansion in their dreams often didn't live to tell the tale. They vanished, leaving behind nothing but a chilling sense of absence and, in some cases, a single blackened mark, like the one on my nightstand. Determined to find out more, I decided to dig into the history of my town, hoping to uncover any connection to the mansion or the figure that haunted me. I spent hours in the local library, sifting through old records, newspapers, and forgotten archives. Most of what I found was mundane, but then, buried in the back pages of a decades-old newspaper, I stumbled upon a story that made my blood run cold. It was an article from the early 1900s detailing the mysterious disappearance of an entire family who had lived on the outskirts of town. The house they had inhabited was described as an old, crumbling mansion hidden deep within a dense forest, its exact location now lost to time. According to the article, the family had complained of strange occurrences, unexplained noises, shadows that moved on their own, and terrifying dreams that plagued them every night. The neighbors reported hearing screams in the dead of night, but when they investigated, the house was always silent, its windows dark. One night, the family vanished without a trace. The house was found empty, the doors wide open, but there was no sign of a struggle, no clues as to where they had gone. The only thing left behind was a single burned handprint on the wooden floor of the master bedroom, still smoldering when the neighbors arrived. My heart pounded as I read and reread the article, the words blurring as fear took hold. The description of the house matched the mansion from my dreams exactly. The decaying walls, the suffocating darkness, even the shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. It was as if the nightmare had come to life, and now it was reaching out across time to claim me as its next victim. But it wasn't just the house that haunted me. It was the figure, the faceless entity that had appeared in my dream. The article mentioned sightings of a shadowy figure seen by the family members in the days leading up to their disappearance. They described it as a man-shaped void with no face, no features, just an abyss of darkness where its eyes should have been. The father had tried to banish it, performing rituals and even consulting with a local priest, but nothing worked. The figure grew bolder, appearing not just in dreams, but in waking life, until it finally took them all. As I sat there, surrounded by dusty records and old newspapers, I felt the air grow cold, a familiar chill creeping over my skin. I wasn't alone. I could feel it, lurking just out of sight, watching me with those empty, hollow eyes. The shadows in the library seemed to stretch and twist, the edges of my vision darkening as if the room itself was being swallowed by the same darkness that had taken the family all those years ago. In a panic, I gathered the papers and fled the library, but the fear followed me, clinging to me like a second skin. I knew, without a doubt, that the figure had found me, that it had been waiting for this moment, biding its time until I was too deep to turn back. The mansion, the book, the dreams, it was all connected, a web of terror that had ensnared me, and there was no escaping it. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. I sat in my room, the lights on, every muscle tensed, waiting for the inevitable. The shadows on the walls seemed to pulse with life, the darkness outside the window pressing in, growing thicker, more tangible. And then, just as the clock struck 3:33 a.m., the whispering began again. Soft at first, then louder, more insistent. It was the same voice from the dream, echoing in my mind, telling me to return to the mansion, to finish what had been started. My hand shook as I reached for the book, which had somehow reappeared on my nightstand, the leather cover cold to the touch. I didn't want to open it, but I knew I had no choice. Whatever was inside, whatever dark force had been unleashed, it was coming for me, and there was nowhere to hide. As I turned the pages, the symbols began to glow, filling the room with an eerie, pale light. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they were a deafening roar, drowning out all thought. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was the figure standing at the foot of my bed, its faceless head tilting in silent judgment. And then, just like the family in the article, I was gone. The terror that had been building over the past days finally reached its breaking point. I was consumed by the fear that something unspeakable was closing in on me, an ancient darkness that had no intention of letting me escape. My life had become a waking nightmare, and every moment was a struggle to maintain my sanity as the boundaries between reality and the dream world disintegrated. The mansion, the faceless figure, the book, they were no longer confined to the realm of sleep. They were here, in my world, and they were relentless. I knew I couldn't keep living like this. I had to find the mansion in the real world to face whatever horror awaited me there. It was the only way to put an end to the nightmares, to reclaim my life from the shadows that had taken hold of it. The prospect of returning to that place filled me with dread, but there was no other choice. The mansion was calling to me, and every fiber of my being knew that ignoring that call would mean my end. I gathered what little courage I had left and set out to find the mansion. I remembered the article from the library, the vague descriptions of the location, and how it was said to be lost in the dense forest at the edge of town. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and a gut-wrenching fear, I drove out to the woods, the trees growing denser and more twisted the deeper I went. The night was unnaturally dark, the moon hidden behind thick clouds, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the cold wind. As I walked through the forest, the shadows seemed to close in around me, the air growing colder with every step. The path ahead was barely visible, and it felt like the forest itself was trying to swallow me whole. My heart pounded in my chest as I fought the urge to turn back. But something deeper than fear drove me forward, a dark compulsion that felt both alien and disturbingly familiar. It was as if the mansion had already claimed me, and I was merely following a script written long before I was born. After what felt like hours of wandering through the twisted trees, I finally saw it. The mansion, looming in the distance like a specter from another world. It was just as I remembered from my dreams, even more decayed and foreboding in reality. The windows were black voids, the walls crumbling and covered in that same dark ivy that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The air around the mansion was thick with a sense of malevolence, as if the very ground beneath it was cursed. I approached the front door, my hands trembling as I reached for the handle. The door creaked open on its own, just as it had in my dreams, revealing the dark interior beyond. The air inside was heavy with the stench of rot and something else, something far worse. I stepped across the threshold and the door slammed shut behind me, sealing me in. There was no turning back now. The inside of the mansion was exactly as I had seen it in my nightmares, dusty, decrepit, and filled with a pervasive sense of dread. The floorboards groaned under my weight, the walls seemed to close in, and the darkness was suffocating. I could feel the eyes of the faceless figure on me, though I couldn't see it. It was here, somewhere, waiting for me to complete the journey I had started in my dreams. As I ventured deeper into the mansion, the whispers began again, echoing through the empty halls, their source impossible to pinpoint. They were the same voices I had heard in my sleep, now louder, more insistent, filling my mind with dark thoughts, urging me to continue. I passed through room after room, each more decayed and sinister than the last, until I found myself standing before the door from my dream, the door that had led to the room with the candle and the book. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, and for a moment, I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to flee this place and never look back, but I knew it was too late. The mansion had already claimed me, and there was no escaping what lay beyond that door. I twisted the knob and pushed the door open, stepping into the room where it all began. The room was exactly as I remembered it, but this time, the candle was already lit, casting an eerie, flickering light over the old leather-bound book that sat on the table. The book was open, its pages filled with the dark symbols that had haunted my dreams. The whispers grew louder as I approached, the air thick with their insistent pleas and warnings. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps as I stared down at the book, knowing that this was the moment of truth. But before I could reach for the book, the room grew cold, colder than anything I had ever felt. The candle sputtered, its flame nearly extinguished, and the shadows around me seemed to pulse with a dark, malevolent energy. And then, from the corner of the room, it emerged, the faceless figure, stepping out of the darkness like a nightmare given form. It was even more terrifying in reality than it had been in my dreams. Its body was a shifting mass of shadow, its face, or what should have been its face, nothing more than a void, an endless abyss of darkness. It moved slowly, deliberately, its form undulating as it approached me. I could feel its presence pressing down on me, a crushing weight that made it difficult to breathe, to think. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The figure stopped just inches from me, its faceless head tilted as if studying me, assessing my fear. The whispers in my mind grew louder, more frantic, as if the voices were trying to warn me of what was to come, but their words were drowned out by the overwhelming terror that gripped me. I was trapped, paralyzed by fear, unable to move, unable to scream. And then, without warning, the figure reached out, its shadowy hand passing through my chest like a knife made of ice. Pain erupted through my body, a cold, searing agony that left me gasping for breath. I could feel it pulling at something deep inside me, something vital, as if it was trying to rip my very soul from my body. The world around me began to fade, the room spinning as darkness closed in, and I knew, in that moment, that this was the end. But just as everything began to fade to black, I heard a voice. Not the whispers, but a single clear voice, cutting through the darkness. It spoke a word, one that I couldn't understand, but that filled the room with a blinding light. The figure recoiled, its grip on me loosening, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The light grew brighter, pushing back the shadows, banishing the darkness that had consumed the room. The figure shrieked, a sound so piercing it felt like it would split my skull, and then it was gone. Pulled back into the void from which it had come, the room was silent, the whispers silenced, the air clear once more. I lay there for what felt like hours, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. The mansion was still, as if it had never been alive to begin with, and the book lay closed on the table, its pages blank and unmarked. The darkness had retreated, but the fear remained, deep in my bones, a permanent scar left by the terror I had faced. I knew then that I had been given a reprieve, a second chance. But at what cost? The figure was gone, but its presence lingered, a shadow that would follow me for the rest of my life. I had survived the mansion, but the darkness was still out there, waiting, watching, ready to strike again when I least expected it. And as I stumbled out of the mansion, the cold night air filling my lungs, I knew that the nightmare was far from over. The darkness had claimed a part of me, and it would never let me go. The air was thick with tension as I stumbled out of the mansion, my mind reeling from the ordeal I had just survived. The dark woods surrounding the mansion felt even more menacing now, the twisted branches reaching out like claws, eager to drag me back into the nightmare I had just escaped. But I wasn't safe. Not yet. Deep down, I knew the horror was far from over. Something had been unleashed, and it was only a matter of time before it came for me again. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The terror of what had transpired was too fresh, too raw, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. Every shadow in my home seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Every creak of the floorboards was a reminder that the faceless figure was still out there, lurking just beyond the veil of reality. I was trapped in a waking nightmare, where every corner of my mind was tainted by the darkness I had encountered. As the hours dragged on, I found myself drawn back to the old leather-bound book. I had left it on the table in the mansion, hoping that leaving it behind would break its hold on me. But when I returned to my home, it was there, waiting on my nightstand as if it had never left. The cover was as cold as ever, the symbols on its pages glowing faintly in the dim light of the room. It was as if the book was alive, breathing with a dark energy that defied all reason. With trembling hands, I opened the book, knowing that whatever lay within its pages held the key to ending this nightmare once and for all. The symbols seemed to shift before my eyes, rearranging themselves into patterns that defied logic, but somehow I understood them. They spoke of an ancient curse, a binding ritual that had been performed centuries ago to imprison something unspeakable within the mansion's walls. The figure I had encountered was no mere apparition. It was a remnant of that dark force, a shadow of its former power, but no less dangerous. As I read on, the whispers began to echo in my mind once more, their voices urgent, desperate, warning me of the danger that was closing in. The book detailed the ritual that had been performed, the sacrifices made to bind the entity, and the consequences of its release. It was clear that by entering the mansion and interacting with the book, I had unwittingly broken the seal that had kept the entity contained. Now it was free to roam, free to spread its darkness across the world, and its first target was me. The final pages of the book revealed the truth. The mansion was not just a place, it was a gateway, a bridge between our world and the dark realm where the entity had been imprisoned. The figure I had encountered was its herald, a harbinger of the chaos and destruction that would follow. And now, with the seal broken, the entity was regaining its strength, preparing to cross the threshold into our world. Unless I could find a way to stop it, everything I knew would be consumed by the darkness. But there was a way. One last, desperate option. The book spoke of a final confrontation, a ritual that could banish the entity back to its prison. But it required a sacrifice, one of unimaginable magnitude. The details were vague, shrouded in cryptic language, but the message was clear. To stop the entity, I would have to give up something precious, something that meant more to me than anything else. As I sat there, the weight of the decision pressing down on me, I realized with a sickening dread what the sacrifice would be. The entity fed on fear, on the darkness within the human soul, and to banish it, I would have to confront the deepest, darkest part of myself, the part that had been tainted by the entity's influence. I would have to face the entity in its true form, within the mansion, and offer up my soul as a vessel to contain it. Only then could I hope to seal it away once more. The thought of returning to the mansion filled me with terror. But I knew I had no choice. The entity was growing stronger with each passing moment, and if I didn't act soon, it would be too late. I gathered what little courage I had left and prepared for the final confrontation, knowing that it would likely be the last thing I ever did. The journey back to the mansion was a blur, my mind racing with fear and desperation. The woods seemed even darker, the shadows more oppressive, as if the very land itself was rebelling against what was about to happen. When I finally reached the mansion, I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the handle as I tried to steel myself for what was to come. But there was no turning back now. Inside, the mansion was just as I had left it, decayed, crumbling, filled with an unnatural darkness that seemed to seep from the walls. The whispers were louder now, filling every corner of my mind, urging me forward, warning me of the danger that lay ahead. But I couldn't stop. The entity was waiting for me, and I had to face it, no matter the cost. I made my way to the room with the candle and the book, the air growing colder with every step. The shadows around me seemed to move of their own accord, shifting and writhing as if alive, and I could feel the entity's presence growing stronger, more tangible. When I reached the room, I found the candle already lit, casting an eerie, flickering light over the pages of the book. The symbols glowed brightly now, pulsing with a dark energy that made my skin crawl. And then, from the shadows, it emerged. The entity, no longer a mere faceless figure, but a towering mass of darkness, its form shifting and undulating like a living nightmare. Its presence was overwhelming, filling the room with a cold, suffocating dread that made it difficult to breathe, to think. I could feel its power, its hunger, and I knew that this was the moment of truth. The ritual began, the words flowing from my lips as if I had known them all along, the symbols in the book guiding me through the steps. The entity watched, its hollow eyes locked on mine as I chanted the ancient incantation, calling upon the forces that had once bound it. The air crackled with energy, the walls of the mansion trembling as the darkness pressed in, but I held my ground, pouring every ounce of willpower I had into the ritual. But then, the final step, the sacrifice. The entity loomed closer, its shadowy form wrapping around me like a suffocating cloak as I reached deep within myself, pulling out the darkness that had taken root there. The pain was excruciating, a searing agony that tore through my very soul. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. This was the only way. As the final words of the incantation left my lips, the entity let out a deafening roar, a sound of pure rage and desperation as it was pulled back into the void from which it had come. The darkness around me began to recede, the shadows dissolving as the light of the candle grew brighter, burning away the last remnants of the entity's power. The mansion shook violently, the walls crumbling, the ceiling collapsing. But I stood firm, holding the entity at bay as the ritual reached its climax. And then, with a final, blinding flash of light, it was over. The entity was gone, sealed away once more, and the mansion lay in ruins, its walls reduced to rubble, its dark influence banished. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted, my body trembling from the strain of the ritual. But I was alive. I had done it. I had stopped the entity. But as I lay there staring up at the night sky through the collapsed roof, I knew that the victory had come at a cost. The darkness within me, the part of myself that had been tainted by the entity, was gone. But so was a part of my soul. I could feel the emptiness inside, a void where something vital had once been, and I knew that I would never be the same again. The mansion was gone, the entity sealed away, but the scars remained, both on the land and within me. I had faced the darkness and survived, but at what cost? The terror, the fear, the nightmares, they would never truly leave me. They were a part of me now, a constant reminder of the horrors I had faced, and the knowledge that the darkness was always waiting, just beyond the veil of reality, ready to return. And as I walked away from the ruins of the mansion, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, I couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare wasn't truly over. The darkness had been sealed away, but it had left a mark on me, a shadow that would follow me for the rest of my life. Because once you face the darkness, it never truly lets you go. The ruins of the mansion lay behind me, but the weight of what I had endured was far from lifted. The dawn's light, normally a symbol of hope and renewal, did nothing to dispel the shadows that clung to my thoughts. The horror may have been sealed away, but something dark and insidious lingered, a remnant of the nightmare that refused to fade. The silence in the aftermath was deafening, and though the entity was gone, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was not the end, merely a pause in a much larger, more sinister game. In the days that followed, I tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but nothing felt the same. The world around me seemed drained of color, lifeless, as if the darkness I had confronted had bled into reality itself. The shadows in my home were longer, darker, and though I knew the entity was no longer with me, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched, like a pair of eyes was always following my every move, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. I began to hear whispers again, just as I was on the edge of sleep, but these were different, softer, more insidious. They weren't the frantic warnings that had echoed through my dreams before. These whispers were almost familiar, like a voice I had known all my life, calling to me from the darkness. They spoke of forgotten secrets, of doors left ajar, of paths yet to be walked. And though I wanted to ignore them, to convince myself they were merely the remnants of trauma, I found myself listening, drawn in by their dark allure. One night the whispers led me to the remains of the mansion, the place where it all began. The ruins were eerily silent, the air thick with the scent of charred wood and earth. I hadn't intended to go there, but something compelled me, a force I couldn't resist. As I stood amidst the rubble, the moon hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground, I realized I wasn't alone. A cold breeze brushed against my skin, carrying with it the faintest hint of something familiar, something I'd hoped never to feel again. Then, I saw it. Just a flicker at first, at the corner of my vision. A movement in the shadows, too fast to track, but unmistakable. My heart pounded as I turned, scanning the ruins, but there was nothing there. And yet, the feeling of being watched was undeniable, growing stronger by the second. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, a trick of the mind, but deep down, I knew the truth. The entity may have been sealed away, but the darkness had left its mark, not just on me, but on the world itself. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, urging me to look closer to see what was hidden in the shadows. And then, in the silence of the night, I heard it. A soft, shuffling sound, like footsteps dragging across the earth. They were coming from behind me, slow, deliberate, each step heavy with purpose. I froze, every muscle tensed, as I realized that whatever had followed me out of the nightmare had found me again. I turned slowly, my breath caught in my throat, and there it was, a figure standing just at the edge of the ruins, bathed in the pale light of the moon. It wasn't the faceless entity, but something else, something familiar. Its form was shrouded in darkness, its features hidden, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through the night, seeing into the very depths of my soul. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was overwhelming, a cold dread that seeped into my bones. For a long moment we stood there, locked in a silent standoff, the air between us thick with tension. I wanted to run, to flee from whatever this was, but my feet were rooted to the spot, held in place by a force I couldn't explain. The figure raised its hand, pointing toward the ground at my feet, and I followed its gesture, my eyes landing on something half buried in the dirt. It was the book. The same old, leather-bound book that had haunted my dreams. The one I had left behind in the mansion, now lying at my feet as if it had never left my side. The cover was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age, but the symbols on its surface still pulsed with that dark, eerie glow. My heart raced as I bent down to pick it up, my fingers brushing against the cold leather, and in that moment, the figure vanished, dissolving into the shadows as if it had never been there. But the book was real, solid, its weight heavy in my hands. I knew I should leave it, abandon it to the ruins, but I couldn't. Something about it called to me, a dark compulsion that I couldn't resist. As I opened the book, the whispers returned, louder, more urgent, filling my mind with their cryptic messages. The pages were blank at first, but as I stared at them, words began to appear, scrawled in a language I couldn't understand, but that filled me with a deep, primal fear. The words spoke of something ancient, something that had been waiting in the dark for far longer than I could comprehend. The ritual I had performed, the entity I had sealed away, it was only a part of a much larger story, a story that was far from over. The book was a key, a doorway to something even darker, something that had been lying dormant for centuries, and now that the door had been opened, it couldn't be closed. As I read, the air around me grew colder, the shadows deeper, and I realized with a sinking dread that I had been wrong. The entity wasn't gone, it had merely been the first of many, a harbinger of what was to come. The real horror was just beginning, and I was the one who had set it in motion. I looked around the ruins, the cold wind whipping through the trees, and I knew I couldn't stay there. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the distance, a flicker of movement in the shadows, just beyond the edge of the forest. It was gone before I could fully register it, but the message was clear. The darkness was still out there, waiting, watching, and it was only a matter of time before it returned. I left the ruins that night, but the book came with me, its weight heavy in my hands, its dark power pulsing just beneath the surface. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. The nightmare was far from over. The darkness had been unleashed, and it would not rest until it had consumed everything in its path. As I walked away, the whispers followed me, a constant reminder of the terror that still lingered, just out of sight. They spoke of things I didn't want to hear, of secrets better left buried, but I couldn't ignore them. The darkness had marked me, and there was no escaping it. So, I ask you, what would you do if the darkness came for you? If the nightmares you thought were just dreams turned out to be real? If the shadows that followed you home were more than just tricks of the light? Would you run, or would you face it, knowing that once you cross that threshold, there is no going back? If you've made it this far, you're braver than most. But remember, bravery can be a dangerous thing. The darkness is always watching, always waiting, and the next time you find yourself alone in the dark, remember this story, because once the darkness has touched you, it never truly lets you go. Subscribe to the channel if you dare, leave your thoughts in the comments, and share this story with those who need to hear it. But be careful. Some stories are better left untold, and the next nightmare might be closer than you think.